A debt now complete. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore had spent years navigating the dangerous web of court politics. But when Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's silent enforcer, caught her slipping a message to the wrong hands, she felt the weight of his gaze. "You hold secrets, my lady," he murmured. "Now, tell me, who do you truly serve? If this table of contents meets your approval, you may issue the command, and I will generate Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Serpent's Kiss. The chill of the stone floor seeped through Lady Emmeline of Dunmore's thin slippers, a stark contrast to the warmth of the crowded great hall. The air, thick with the scent of roasted boar, beeswax candles, and the ever-present undercurrent of unwashed bodies, usually offered a strange comfort, a familiar cloak of normalcy in a world constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. Tonight, however, the familiar scents were tainted with a metallic tang of fear that clung to the back of her throat. Emmeline's fingers, usually deft at embroidery or playing the lute, trembled slightly as she adjusted the heavy silver chain that held her late husband's crest, a snarling wolf's head, against her velvet gown. The weight of it, a constant reminder of her duty to Dunmore and the precarious position she now occupied, felt heavier than usual. Lord Dunmore, her husband, had been dead these past 5 years, leaving her a widow at 32 and the sole protector of their young son, Thomas, the heir to their lands. A prize, some would say, for any ambitious lord seeking to expand their influence. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of court, to smile when she wanted to scream, to agree when every fiber of her being screamed dissent. She had mastered the art of the veiled insult, the subtle threat, the carefully crafted lie. Survival, she had discovered, was a performance, and she had become a master actress. But tonight, the stage felt different, the audience more discerning. The king's feast, celebrating the victory over the rebellious northern lords, was in full swing. Bards sang of valor and bloodshed, their voices competing with the boisterous laughter of the assembled nobility. King Alaric, a man whose jovial exterior often masked a ruthless intellect, held court at the high table, his queen, Isolde, a vision of icy beauty, at his side. Emmeline had always found the queen unsettling, her gaze too sharp, her smile too knowing. It was Isolde who had summoned Emmeline to court, ostensibly to serve as a lady-in-waiting. In reality, Emmeline was the queen's eyes and ears, a carefully placed pawn in the endless game of power. The messages she carried, the whispers she gleaned, were vital to the queen's intricate web of alliances and schemes. Tonight's message, however, was different. It was not meant for the queen. Emmeline felt the weight of the small, rolled parchment hidden within the folds of her sleeve. It was addressed to Lord Ashford, a powerful nobleman with a known dislike for the king and a whispered ambition for the throne. The contents were delicate. A list of names, those who secretly supported Ashford's cause, a list that could topple the kingdom if it fell into the wrong hands. She had been careful, meticulous. She had waited until the opportune moment, when the king was distracted by a particularly bawdy jest from his fool, to slip the parchment to Ashford's young page, a boy with wide, innocent eyes who she had used before. But as the boy scurried away, a shadow fell over her. Sir Roderick Locksley. He stood there, silent and imposing, like a statue carved from granite. The king's enforcer, they called him, the king's shadow. A man of few words and even fewer smiles. He was known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown and his brutal efficiency in dealing with its enemies. His dark eyes, the color of a stormy sea, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade, seeing the fear that lay beneath. He was taller than most men, his broad shoulders straining against the dark fabric of his tunic, embroidered with the royal crest, a golden lion rampant. A long scar bisected his left eyebrow, a memento from some long-ago battle, lending him a perpetually grim expression. He wore no jewelry, save for a heavy silver ring on his right hand, bearing the same lion crest. His presence radiated an aura of controlled power, a silent threat that sent a shiver down Emmeline's spine. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the hall. It was not a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement of her presence, and, she feared, her transgression. She forced a smile, the one she used when dealing with particularly difficult courtiers. "Sir Roderick. A pleasure, as always." "You seem preoccupied," he observed, his gaze unwavering. He did not move closer, but his presence seemed to fill the space around her, suffocating her. "Merely enjoying the festivities," she replied, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. "The king's victory is a cause for celebration, is it not?" "Indeed," he agreed, his eyes flicking to the spot where the page had disappeared into the crowd. "Celebration. And loyalty." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmeline's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She had been so careful, so meticulous. How had he seen? He took a step closer, and she instinctively recoiled, her back pressing against the cold stone wall. The scent of him, leather and steel and something else, something wild and untamed, filled her senses. It was a scent that spoke of battlefields and long nights spent in the saddle, a scent that both terrified and intrigued her. "You hold secrets, my lady," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear it. His gaze dropped to her sleeve, to the spot where the parchment had been hidden. "Now, tell me, who do you truly serve?" The question was a trap, she knew. A denial would be futile. He had seen something, enough to arouse his suspicion. But to confess would be to betray not only herself, but the delicate network of alliances she had so carefully cultivated. It would be to sign her own death warrant, and perhaps Thomas's as well. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a loophole, a lie that would satisfy him. But his eyes, those dark, penetrating eyes, held her captive. She felt like a deer caught in the hunter's snare, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling around her. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some carefully worded evasion, but the words caught in her throat. The truth, raw and terrifying, rose up within her, threatening to spill out. She was trapped, cornered, exposed. And in the depths of Sir Roderick Locksley's gaze, she saw not only accusation, but something else, something that made her breath catch in her chest. A flicker of understanding? Perhaps even pity? It was the pity that broke her. The realization that this man, this ruthless enforcer, saw her not as a cunning spy, but as a vulnerable woman caught in a game far larger than herself. A game she could no longer play. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She closed them, bracing herself for the inevitable. The arrest, the imprisonment, the execution. It was over. But the expected accusation never came. Instead, she felt a gentle touch on her arm, a hand surprisingly warm against the cold velvet of her sleeve. She opened her eyes, startled. Sir Roderick was looking at her, his expression still grim, but the hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper against her ear, so low that even the nearby revelers couldn't hear. "The game is dangerous, Lady Emmeline," he said. "And sometimes the only way to survive is to choose a side." He held her gaze, that spark, something new born between fear and captivation. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stone Hall. The warmth of Sir Roderick's hand on her arm lingered, a phantom sensation even after he had withdrawn it. Emmeline's skin prickled where he had touched her, a confusing mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar awareness. The noise of the great hall, the boisterous laughter and clatter of plates, seemed to fade into a distant hum, her senses hyper-focused on the man standing before her. He hadn't raised the alarm. He hadn't summoned the guards. Instead, he had offered a cryptic warning, a veiled what? Offer? Threat? She couldn't be sure. The ambiguity was a torment, a subtle form of torture far more effective than any Iron Maiden.
"Choose a side," he had said.
But which side? Loyalty to the Queen, who had used her as a pawn, risking her life and her son's future? Loyalty to Lord Ashford, a man who promised change, but whose ambition reeked of danger? Or loyalty to Sir Roderick himself, a man who represented the very power structure she had been fighting against, yet who had shown her a flicker of compassion? The thought was absurd, dangerous even. Yet, it lingered in her mind, a seed of something unexpected planted in the barren soil of her fear. As she began, her voice trembling, unsure of what to say, what to confess, what to deny, he raised a hand, silencing her. "Not here," he said, his voice still a low murmur, barely audible above the din of the hall.
"Meet me."
The chapel. After the last prayer. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and melted back into the crowd, disappearing as quickly and silently as he had appeared, leaving Emmeline standing there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The chapel. After the last prayer. It was a risk, a gamble. He could be setting a trap, leading her to a place where she could be easily apprehended, away from the prying eyes of the court. But to refuse would be to confirm his suspicions, to solidify her guilt. She had no choice. The rest of the feast passed in a blur. Emmeline moved through the motions, smiling, nodding, exchanging pleasantries, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt like a ghost, drifting through a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. Every glance, every whisper, seemed to be directed at her, accusing her. She managed to eat a few morsels of food, to sip a little wine, but her appetite was gone. The rich flavors tasted like ash in her mouth. Her gaze kept drifting to the entrance of the hall, searching for Sir Roderick, but he was nowhere to be seen. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin. The king, flushed with wine and good cheer, retired to his chambers, followed by his queen and a retinue of courtiers. The remaining guests, those not fortunate enough to be invited to the king's private revels, began to make their way to their own beds. Emmeline waited until the hall was almost empty, until the last of the servants were clearing away the remnants of the feast. Then, with a deep breath, she rose from her seat and made her way towards the chapel. The castle was a labyrinth of corridors and stairways, a confusing maze of stone and shadow. Emmeline had lived here for years, yet she still found herself getting lost. Tonight, however, her steps were guided by a sense of urgency, a desperate need to know what awaited her. The air grew colder as she descended into the lower levels of the castle, the scent of beeswax and incense replacing the lingering aroma of food and wine. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the echo of her own footsteps and the occasional creak of a distant door. She reached the chapel, a small, dimly lit space tucked away in a quiet corner of the castle. The only light came from a few flickering candles placed before the altar, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the lingering prayers of centuries. He was there. Sir Roderick stood near the altar, his back to her, his head bowed in prayer. Or perhaps not. He was too still, too tense, to be truly praying. He was waiting. Emmeline hesitated at the entrance, her hand on the cold iron of the door handle. She could still turn back, she thought. She could still run, disappear into the night, take her chances. But something held her there, a sense of inevitability. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, the sound echoing through the silent chapel. Sir Roderick turned, his face illuminated by the candlelight. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark pools in the shadows. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate within the stone walls. "You came." It was not a question, but a statement. He had known she would. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the sound echoing like a final judgment. The silence descended again, heavier now, more oppressive. "You summon me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "I did." He gestured towards a small wooden bench near the altar.
"Seat."
She obeyed, her legs trembling beneath her. She sat on the edge of the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the flickering candles. He remained standing, his presence looming over her, a silent, watchful guardian. Or perhaps a jailer. "You saw the message," she said, finally breaking the silence. It was not a question, but a confession. He inclined his head. "I did. And you did not report me." This time it was a question, a plea for understanding. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the intensity of his gaze. It was unnerving, terrifying, yet strangely compelling.
Why?
She whispered, the word barely audible. Why did you not betray me? He finally spoke, his voice low and measured. Because I believe there is more to you than meets the eye, Lady Emmeline.
More than a mere spy.
His words surprised her. She had expected condemnation, accusation, perhaps even a threat. But not this. Not belief. I do not understand, she said, her voice trembling. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. You serve the Queen, he said. But your heart is not with her. He was right. She had served the Queen out of fear, out of duty, out of a desperate need to protect her son. But her heart had always yearned for something more, something different. And the message, he continued. It was not meant for the Queen. Again, he was right. The message to Lord Ashford was a gamble, a desperate attempt to find a new protector, a new ally. A foolish gamble, perhaps, but she had been driven by desperation. How did you know? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that did little to soften the harsh lines of his face. I have my ways, he said. I see things. I hear things. I know things. He was the king's enforcer, after all. The king's shadow. It was his job to know. And what will you do now? She asked, her voice trembling. Will you betray me to the king? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, creating an illusion of movement, of life, in the stillness of the chapel. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that wrapped around her, stealing her breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. That depends, he said.
On you.
He held her gaze, the question a weight in his silence. The candlelight glinted off the silver ring on his finger, the golden lion seeming to watch her, judging her. Chapter 3. The Falcon and the Dove. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. That depends.
On you.
The weight of that statement pressed down on Emmeline, suffocating her with its ambiguity. What did he want from her? What game was he playing? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for some clue, some hint of his intentions. But his expression remained unreadable, a mask of stoic calm that hid the thoughts and emotions swirling beneath the surface. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on his face, making him seem almost otherworldly. A creature of myth, a guardian of secrets. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling, barely a whisper above the crackling of the candles. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved, slowly, deliberately, circling her like a predator assessing its prey. She remained seated on the wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze following his every move. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, punctuated only by the occasional drip of melting wax from the candles. Finally, he stopped, standing directly in front of her, his presence looming over her, blocking out the light. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, her neck feeling vulnerable, exposed. You are caught between two powerful forces, Lady Emmeline, he said, his voice low and resonant, echoing in the stillness of the chapel. The Queen and Lord Ashford. Both are dangerous. Both are playing a game that could cost you your life. She knew this. She had known it from the moment she had agreed to carry the Queen's messages, from the moment she had slipped the parchment to Ashford's page. She was a pawn, a piece on a chessboard, easily sacrificed for a greater gain. And you? She asked, her voice a little stronger now, fueled by a flicker of defiance. Where do you stand in this game? He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that did little to soften the harsh lines of his face. I serve the king, he said. My loyalty is to him, and to him alone. It was the answer she had expected, yet it still sent a shiver of disappointment through her. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for something more. Something different. "Then you should arrest me," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You should take me to the king and expose my treachery." He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes boring into hers, seeming to see through her carefully constructed facade, to the fear and desperation that lay beneath. "But you haven't," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "You haven't arrested me. You haven't betrayed me."
Why?
The silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier. Emmeline could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a roaring sound that drowned out everything else. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear him. "Because I believe you are not my enemy." His words surprised her. She had expected condemnation, accusation, perhaps even a threat. But not this. Not acceptance. I do not understand," she said, her voice trembling. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, enveloping her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the scent of leather and steel and something else, something wild and untamed, filling her senses. "You are like a dove, Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice a soft murmur, caught in a falcon's talons. "You are surrounded by predators, by those who would use you, discard you, destroy you." The analogy was apartment. She was the dove, fragile and vulnerable, surrounded by falcons, powerful and ruthless. The queen, Ashford, even the king himself, they were all falcons, circling, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you a falcon, Sir Roderick?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her face. Then he slowly shook his head.
"No," he said.
"I am something else." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He simply left the statement hanging in the air, a mystery, an enigma.
"What do you want from me?"
she asked, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. The anticipation was almost unbearable. "I want you to trust me," he said, his voice low and intense. Trust him? Trust the king's enforcer, the man who had caught her in an act of treason? It was madness. It was impossible. Yet there was something in his eyes, something in his voice, that made her hesitate. Something that spoke of honesty, of integrity, of something else. Something she couldn't quite define. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He finally touched her, his fingers gently closing over hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a shock that startled her. His hand was warm and strong, calloused from years of wielding a sword, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Because I can protect you," he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "I can keep you safe." The offer was tempting, seductive. To be protected, to be safe. After years of living in fear, of constantly looking over her shoulder, it was a dream she had almost given up on. But could she trust him? Could she really put her life, her son's life, in the hands of this man, this stranger, this enemy? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read the truth in his dark, enigmatic gaze. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced and shifted, making it impossible to see clearly. But in that moment, as their eyes met, she saw something. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of pain, a shadow of something lost. It was a fleeting glimpse, a momentary crack in his stoic facade, but it was enough. It was enough to make her believe. "I will try," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "That is all I ask." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, but it sent a shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her veins, chasing away the chill of the chapel. He released her, and the cool returned. He looked out, toward the altar and the crucifix. "The Queen believes you loyal. Ashford thinks you his ally." He turned back to her. Now you must decide. Chapter 4. A Dance of Shadows and Secrets. The weight of his words settled upon Emmeline like the heavy, embroidered tapestries that adorned the castle walls. Now you must decide. The choice was hers, he said, but the options presented were far from simple. Each path was fraught with peril, each decision a step further into a labyrinth of intrigue where one wrong turn could lead to ruin. How can I choose? She asked, her voice a fragile thread in the vast silence of the chapel. To betray the Queen is treason. To betray Ashford, she hesitated, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Ashford was known for his ruthlessness, his swift and brutal vengeance against those who crossed him. Sir Roderick remained silent, his gaze unwavering, offering no guidance, no easy answers. He was a sphinx, guarding the entrance to a dangerous riddle. The candlelight flickered, casting his face in alternating patterns of light and shadow, making him appear both menacing and strangely alluring. You said you serve the king, Emmeline continued, her voice gaining a little strength, fueled by a desperate need to understand. But your actions, they speak of something else. You could have exposed me, yet you didn't.
Why?
He finally moved, stepping away from her, his boots echoing softly on the stone floor. He walked towards the altar, his back to her, his silhouette outlined against the flickering candlelight. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict, some unspoken dilemma. The king, he began, his voice low and hesitant, is a good man, a strong ruler. But he is surrounded by vipers. Those who whisper in his ear, who manipulate him, who seek to use him for their own gain. He turned back to face her, his expression still shadowed, but his eyes burning with an intensity that startled her. The Queen, she is one of them. Ashford another. They are both playing a dangerous game, a game that could tear the kingdom apart. Emmeline knew this. She had seen it firsthand, the subtle machinations, the veiled threats, the constant struggle for power. She had been a part of it, a pawn in their game. And you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What is your role in this game? He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that did little to soften the harsh lines of his face. I am a protector, he said. I protect the king. I protect the realm. From those who would seek to harm it. It was a noble sentiment, yet Emmeline couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. There was something hidden beneath the surface, some secret that he was guarding, a secret that was intimately connected to her own fate. And how does protecting the realm involve me? She asked, her voice trembling. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the scent of leather and steel and something else, something wild and untamed, filling her senses. You have information, he said, his voice a low murmur. You have access. You can be useful. Useful. The word stung, a reminder of her position, a pawn, a tool to be used and discarded. Yet there was something in his tone, something in his eyes, that suggested something more. Something different. Useful how? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. The anticipation was almost unbearable. You can tell me what you know, he said, his voice low and intense. About the Queen. About Ashford. About their plans. He wanted her to betray them. Both of them. To become his spy, his informant. To risk everything, for him. It was madness. It was impossible. Yet she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read the truth in his dark, enigmatic gaze. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced and shifted, making it impossible to see clearly. But in that moment, as their eyes met, she saw something. A flicker of hope, a glimmer of trust, a spark of something else. Something that drew her in, that made her want to believe. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. Then I cannot protect you, he said. And you will be at the mercy of those who would seek to destroy you. It was a threat, veiled but clear. A threat that sent a shiver of fear down her spine. But it was also a promise. A promise of protection, of safety, if she chose to trust him. The choice was hers. A dance between shadows and secrets. A dance with a man who was both her captor and, perhaps, her savior. She would need information, that much was true. But the cost. The queen had spies everywhere, that much was certain. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her decision. "I will tell you what I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I need your assurance that you will protect me and my son." Sir Roderick nodded, a single, solemn nod. "You have my word," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I will protect you, both of you, with my life." He held her gaze, and for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of hope begin to grow in the cold, barren landscape of her fear. The decision could prove a fatal one, but she needed to have faith. She looked up at him, a new determination in her eyes. Then we begin at dawn. Chapter 5. The Price of Loyalty. Dawn broke gray and cold, the weak light filtering through the narrow windows of Emmeline's chamber, painting the stone walls in shades of pale gray. Sleep had eluded her, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties and half-formed plans. The agreement she had struck with Sir Roderick in the chapel felt both reckless and strangely exhilarating. A leap of faith into the unknown, with the promise of safety hanging precariously in the balance. She rose and dressed quickly, choosing a simple gown of dark blue wool, practical and unassuming. She needed to appear calm, composed, to betray nothing of the turmoil within. The queen was perceptive, her gaze sharp and discerning. Any hint of nervousness, any change in demeanor, would be noticed, questioned. As she braided her hair, her fingers fumbled with the strands, her reflection in the small, polished silver mirror a stranger to her. The woman staring back was pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with worry, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. This was not the carefree widow she had once been, but a woman forged in the fires of adversity, a woman who had learned to fight for survival. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was too early for her maid, too late for any casual visitor. "Enter," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the fear that churned within. The door opened, and Sir Roderick stepped inside. He was dressed in his usual dark attire, his sword strapped to his side, his expression unreadable. He looked even more imposing in the confines of her chamber, his presence filling the small space, making it feel even smaller. "You are ready," he said, his voice a low rumble, not a question. She nodded. "As I will ever be." He surveyed her, his dark eyes taking in every detail, from the simple gown to the tightly braided hair. "You look different," he observed, his voice neutral.
Different.
Yes, she was different. She was no longer merely a pawn in the queen's game. She was something else. Something more. "I am," she agreed, her voice firm. "I am no longer afraid." It wasn't entirely true. Fear still lingered, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But she had made her choice, and she would not waver. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good. Fear is a weakness. And weakness is dangerous." He gestured towards the door.
Come.
"We have much to discuss." He led her not to the bustling kitchens or the great hall, where breakfast would soon be served, but to a small, secluded solar at the end of a long, deserted corridor. It was a room she had rarely used, a place for quiet contemplation, for reading and embroidery. The air was still and cold, the remnants of last night's fire a pile of cold ashes in the hearth. He closed the door behind them, the sound echoing in the silence. He then turned to a tapestry hanging on the wall, depicting a hunting scene, and pulled it aside, revealing a small, hidden alcove. "No one will disturb us here," he said, his voice low. Emmeline stared at the alcove, surprised. She had lived in this castle for years, yet she had never known of its existence. It was a testament to Sir Roderick's knowledge, his intimate understanding of the castle's secrets. He gestured for her to sit on a small, cushioned bench within the alcove. She obeyed, her legs trembling slightly. He remained standing, his back to the tapestry, his presence a silent, watchful guard. "Now," he said, his voice a low murmur, "tell me everything. Start with the queen. What are her plans? Who are her allies? What are her weaknesses?" Emmeline took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had spent years observing the queen, listening to her whispers, deciphering her hidden messages. She knew more than she had ever dared to admit, even to herself. She began to speak, her voice soft but clear, recounting everything she knew. She spoke of the queen's ambition, her desire to control the king, to manipulate the court, to expand her power. She spoke of her secret alliances, her network of spies, her carefully crafted plans. She spoke of Lord Ashford, the queen's most dangerous rival, the man who coveted the throne. She spoke of his supporters, his growing influence, his whispered threats. She spoke of the delicate balance of power, the constant struggle between the various factions, the ever-present threat of war. As she spoke, Sir Roderick listened intently, his gaze fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. He asked few questions, but his silence was more demanding than any interrogation. He was a sponge, absorbing every detail, every nuance, every unspoken implication. Hours passed. The weak morning light gradually strengthened, filling the alcove with a pale, ethereal glow. Emmeline's throat grew dry, her voice hoarse, but she continued to speak, driven by a sense of urgency, a desperate need to unburden herself of the secrets she had carried for so long. Finally, she fell silent, exhausted but strangely relieved. She had told him everything. She had laid bare her soul, her fears, her hopes. She had placed her trust, her life, in his hands. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up at her, his eyes dark and intense. "You have been very thorough, Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice low and measured. "More thorough than I expected." She met his gaze, her chin held high. "I told you I would tell you everything." He nodded.
"You did."
"And I appreciate your honesty." There was a pause. "The Queen holds a gathering tomorrow night. A small, select group. She plans to discuss." He looked at her, to see if she knew. Emily nodded. The alliance with the Southern Lords. A move to solidify her position against Ashford. Sir Roderick's eyes showed a glimmer of surprise. "You were not meant to know those details. I have my ways." She almost smiled, a shadow of her old self returning. He studied her. "You will attend that gathering." The command held a layer of protectiveness. Chapter 6. Beneath a Cloak of Midnight. The Queen's gathering was to be held in her private chambers, a suite of rooms opulent even by royal standards. Tapestries depicting scenes of mythical beasts and heroic battles adorned the walls, their rich colors glowing in the soft candlelight. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and exotic spices, a deliberate attempt to create an atmosphere of intimacy and exclusivity. Emmeline arrived precisely on time, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had chosen a gown of deep emerald green velvet, a color that complemented her auburn hair and pale skin. The dress was elegant but understated, designed to draw attention without being ostentatious. She needed to blend in, to observe, to listen without attracting undue scrutiny. Sir Roderick had been clear in his instructions. She was to attend the gathering as usual, to act as if nothing had changed. She was to observe the Queen, to note her interactions with the other guests, to glean any information that might be useful. He had also warned her to be careful, to trust no one, to speak only when spoken to. The risk was immense. If the Queen discovered her betrayal, the consequences would be dire. Yet, Emmeline felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet determination that had replaced the fear that had consumed her for so long. She had chosen her side, and she would play her part. The Queen greeted her with a cool smile, her eyes, as always, sharp and discerning. "Lady Emmeline, you look radiant," she said, her voice smooth and melodious, like a silken whisper. Emmeline curtsied, her movements graceful and practiced. "Your Majesty is too kind," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. The other guests began to arrive, a small, select group of nobles and courtiers, all known for their loyalty to the Queen. Emmeline recognized most of them, had exchanged pleasantries with them countless times. But tonight, she saw them in a new light, seeing the hidden agendas, the veiled ambitions, the subtle power plays. Lord Selwyn, a portly nobleman with a reputation for greed and ruthlessness, was there, his eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing the value of everything and everyone. Lady Beatrice, a young and ambitious widow, known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue, was also present, her gaze lingering a little too long on the Queen, a hint of envy in her eyes. And then there was Lord Ashford. Emmeline's heart skipped a beat when she saw him. He was standing near the fireplace, his back to her, engaged in conversation with Lord Selwyn. He was a tall, imposing figure, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face a mask of cold authority. He exuded an aura of power, of danger, that made Emmeline's skin prickle with unease. She had not seen him since the night of the King's feast, since she had slipped the message to his page. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he would not be present at the Queen's gathering. His presence complicated matters, increased the risk. She forced herself to remain calm, to maintain her composure. She could not afford to show any sign of weakness, any hint of fear. The Queen clapped her hands, silencing the murmur of conversation. "My lords, my ladies," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "Let us begin." The gathering proceeded as Emmeline had anticipated. The Queen spoke of the need for unity, for strength, in the face of growing unrest. She spoke of the threat posed by Lord Ashford, his ambition, his treachery. She spoke of the importance of securing the alliance with the Southern Lords, a move that would solidify her position and weaken Ashford's influence. Emmeline listened intently, observing the reactions of the other guests. She noted the subtle nods of agreement, the veiled expressions of doubt, the hidden glances of suspicion. She was a silent observer, a witness to the intricate dance of power. As the evening wore on, the conversation became more specific. The Queen revealed details of her plan, the strategies she intended to employ, the alliances she had forged. Emmeline committed everything to memory, every word, every gesture, every unspoken implication. She noticed that Lord Ashford remained silent throughout most of the gathering, his expression unreadable. He listened intently, his eyes fixed on the Queen, but he offered no comment, no opinion. He was a predator, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Finally, as the gathering was drawing to a close, the Queen turned to Emmeline. "Lady Emmeline," she said, her voice smooth and melodious, "you have been unusually quiet this evening. Have you nothing to contribute?" Emmeline's heart leaped into her throat. She had been hoping to avoid the Queen's attention, to remain in the shadows. But she knew she could not refuse to speak. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady, "I am merely absorbing the wisdom of your words. I am, as always, in awe of your strategic brilliance." It was a carefully crafted answer, designed to flatter the Queen without revealing anything of substance. It was a lie, of course, but a necessary one. The Queen smiled, seemingly satisfied with her response. "You are too kind, Lady Emmeline," she said. "But I value your discretion. It is a rare quality, in these treacherous times." The Queen's words were like a serpent's kiss, sweet, alluring, but laced with venom. The gathering ended soon after, each person giving their fealty with veiled words. As the guests departed, one by one, Emmeline waited until she and the Queen were alone. "Majesty," she began, a question masked as an offering. "Might I ask about Lord Ashford's silence?" The Queen gave her a cold, hard stare. "He is a fox, Emmeline. Always watching, always waiting. Do not underestimate him." As she left the room, she felt a presence behind. "Well played, Lady Emmeline," Sir Roderick said, his breath warm by her ear. He had been there all along. Hidden in plain sight, he moved with ease. But the night is not over yet. Chapter 7. The King's Decree. The chill of the night air bit at Emmeline's exposed skin as she followed Sir Roderick through the darkened castle corridors. The opulent warmth of the Queen's chambers was a distant memory, replaced by the cold, damp reality of stone and shadow. They moved silently, their footsteps echoing softly on the flagstones, two figures cloaked in darkness, their purpose hidden from the prying eyes of the court. "Where are we going?" Emmeline whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of her skirts. "To the king," Roderick replied, his voice a low murmur, his breath clouding in the cold air. The king. The very thought sent a shiver of apprehension down Emmeline's spine. She had played her part at the Queen's gathering, had listened and observed, had even dared to question the Queen herself. But to face the king, that was a different matter entirely. She had always found King Alaric an enigma. He was a man of contradictions, capable of both great kindness and ruthless cruelty. He was a skilled warrior, a shrewd politician, and a devoted husband. Yet he was also easily swayed by flattery, by the whispers of his advisers, by the machinations of his queen. She had never been close to the king, had always maintained a respectful distance. She had seen him as a figurehead, a symbol of power, but not as a man she could trust.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are we going to the king?" Roderick stopped, turning to face her. His face was illuminated by the faint light of a distant torch, casting his features in sharp relief. His eyes, usually so dark and unreadable, seemed to burn with an intensity that startled her. "Because the time has come," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The Queen's plans, they are more dangerous than I had anticipated. She is playing with fire, and she could burn the entire kingdom down." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. The gesture was becoming familiar, a source of both comfort and something else. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. "I need your help, Emmeline," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "I need you to tell the king everything." Everything. The weight of that word pressed down on her. To betray the Queen to the king, it was treason of the highest order. The punishment would be swift and brutal. Yet, she had already betrayed the Queen. She had chosen her side. She had placed her trust in Sir Roderick. "And if he doesn't believe me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "If he believes the Queen instead?" Roderick's hand finally touched hers, his fingers gently closing around hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a shock that startled her. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of protection. "He will believe you," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I will make sure of it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He simply offered his assurance, his confidence, his belief in her. And, strangely, she believed him. They continued their journey through the darkened corridors, their silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of a door, the distant sound of a guard's patrol. Emmeline's mind raced, trying to anticipate the king's reaction, trying to prepare herself for the ordeal ahead. They reached the king's chambers, a suite of rooms even more opulent than the queen's. Two guards stood outside the door, their faces impassive, their spears held at the ready. Roderick approached them, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He spoke to them in a low voice, his words inaudible to Emmeline. The guards hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to allow them entry. The king was awake, sitting in a large chair by the fireplace, a book in his lap. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening in surprise. He was dressed in a simple nightgown, his gray hair unkempt, his face pale and drawn. He looked older than his years, weary and burdened by the weight of his crown. "Roderick?" he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "What is the meaning of this? And Lady Emmeline?" Roderick stepped forward, bowing low. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "I have urgent news. News that cannot wait." The king frowned, his gaze shifting from Roderick to Emmeline. "What news? What has happened?" Roderick glanced at Emmeline, a silent signal for her to speak. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped forward, curtsying deeply. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have information." "Information about the Queen." The king's eyes narrowed. "The Queen? What about her?" Emmeline hesitated, gathering her courage. She looked at Roderick, seeking his reassurance. He nodded, his expression encouraging. She took another deep breath and began to speak, her voice gaining strength as she recounted everything she knew. She spoke of the Queen's ambition, her secret alliances, her plans to solidify her power. She spoke of Lord Ashford, of the threat he posed, of the delicate balance of power that was about to be shattered. As she spoke, the king listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. He asked few questions, but his silence was more terrifying than any outburst. He was a judge, weighing the evidence, assessing the truth. Finally, she fell silent, exhausted and drained. She had told him everything. She had laid bare her soul, her fears, her betrayals. The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. The room was filled with the crackling of the flames, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Is this true, Emmeline?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Has my wife betrayed me?" Emmeline met his gaze, her chin held high. "It is true, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm. "I swear it on my life, and on the life of my son." The king looked at Roderick, seeking confirmation. Roderick nodded, his expression solemn. "I believe her, Your Majesty," he said. "I have seen the evidence. I have heard the whispers. Lady Emmeline speaks the truth." The king closed his eyes, his face contorted in pain. He seemed to age before their very eyes, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a cold fury. "Summon the Queen," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "And Lord Ashford. I will have answers." Roderick bowed. "As you command, Your Majesty." He paused. "But first a decree, my king. Protection. For the lady and her son." King Alaric looked at Emmeline. He could see her, not as a spy, but as a soul caught within a storm not her own. Granted. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past. The king's decree of protection offered a fragile shield against the storm that was brewing. Emmeline was moved to a different chamber, one closer to the king's own, under the watchful eyes of Sir Roderick's most trusted men. Thomas, her son, was brought to her, his young face filled with confusion and fear. She held him close, drawing strength from his presence, her love for him a fierce, unwavering flame in the darkness. Sleep, once again, proved elusive. The events of the past few days had left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally, yet her mind remained relentlessly active, replaying every conversation, every glance, every unspoken threat. The confrontation between the king, the queen, and Lord Ashford was imminent, and the outcome was far from certain. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the pre-dawn sky, when she heard a soft knock on the door. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. "Enter," she said, her voice a little shaky. It was Sir Roderick. He was dressed in his usual dark attire, but his sword was gone, replaced by a simple dagger at his belt. He looked different, less imposing, more approachable. "I could not sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble, by way of explanation. She nodded, understanding. She couldn't sleep either. He gestured towards a small table near the fireplace, where a tray of food had been placed. "You should eat," he said. "You need your strength." She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she saw the food. She had barely eaten in days, her appetite suppressed by fear and anxiety. She sat at the table and began to eat, slowly, mechanically, her mind still preoccupied with the impending confrontation. Roderick sat opposite her, watching her in silence. He didn't eat, didn't speak, simply observed her with his dark, enigmatic gaze. "What will happen?" she asked, finally breaking the silence, her voice barely a whisper. He shrugged, his broad shoulders moving slightly beneath the dark fabric of his tunic. I do not know, he said. The king is unpredictable. Especially now. She knew this. She had seen the king's volatile temper, his ability to shift from jovial good humor to cold, ruthless anger in an instant. He believes me, though, she said, more to herself than to him. He believes your words.
And the decree.
Roderick nodded. He believes you. Thanks to you. And my corroboration. But the queen, she began, her voice trailing off. The queen was a formidable opponent, cunning and resourceful. She would not surrender easily. She would fight, she would lie, she would manipulate. She will deny everything, Roderick said, finishing her thought. She will claim it as a plot, a conspiracy to discredit her. Emmeline knew this. She had seen the queen's ability to twist the truth, to turn accusations against her accusers. And Ashford?
She asked.
What will he do? Ashford was the wild card, the unpredictable element in the equation. He was ambitious, ruthless, and desperate. He would do anything to protect himself, to seize the opportunity to advance his own cause. He will play the innocent, Roderick said. He will claim he knows nothing of the queen's plans. He will try to distance himself from her, to save his own skin. It was a likely scenario, and a dangerous one. If Ashford managed to convince the king of his innocence, he would remain a threat, a viper waiting to strike. They fell silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Emmeline finished her meal, her appetite sated, but her mind still racing. She looked up at Roderick, her eyes searching his face. You have been very kind, she said, her voice a little hesitant.
To me.
To my son.
Why?
He didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. I told you, he said, finally, his voice low and rough. I believe you are not my enemy. But there is more to it than that, isn't there? She pressed, her voice gaining a little strength. There is something personal. He hesitated, then nodded, slowly. There is, he admitted. He rose from his chair and walked towards the window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, his silhouette outlined against the faint light of the dawn, his broad shoulders tense and rigid. I had a wife, he said, finally, his voice so low she had to strain to hear him. And a son. Emmeline's heart skipped a beat. She had never known. He had always seemed so solitary, so self-contained. What happened? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned back to face her, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sorrow. They were killed, he said, his voice raw and emotionless. During the Northern Rebellion. 5 years ago. 5 years ago. The same year her own husband had died. I am so sorry, she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He nodded, accepting her sympathy, but his expression remained unchanged. They were caught in the crossfire, he continued, his voice a little unsteady. Ashford's men. They were brutal, merciless. Ashford. The name hung in the air between them, a shared enemy, a common source of pain. I swore then, he said, his voice gaining strength, fueled by anger and a thirst for revenge, that I would bring him to justice, that I would make him pay for what he had done. Emmeline understood. She understood the pain, the grief, the burning desire for revenge. She had felt it herself, after her husband's death. And the queen? She asked, her voice soft. Where does she fit into this? Roderick's expression hardened.
She is complicit, he said.
She may not have ordered the attack, but she knew. She knew what Ashford was capable of, and she did nothing to stop him. She used him. She profited from his brutality. Emmeline saw it then, the connection, the reason for his unwavering loyalty to the king, his determination to protect the realm. It was not just duty, it was personal. It was about revenge. And redemption. I understand, she said, her voice filled with a new understanding, a new respect for this man, this warrior, this protector. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers.
Do you?
He asked, his voice a little uncertain. She nodded. I do, she said. And I will help you. In any way I can. A faint smile touched his lips. He extended a hand, calloused yet gentle. Then we will face this together. We have a reckoning coming. The scars of his past met the wounds of her present, a fragile bond. Chapter 9. The Tournament of Treachery. The summons came swiftly, as expected. Emmeline, accompanied by Sir Roderick and a contingent of the King's Guard, was escorted to the Great Hall. The room, usually a scene of feasting and revelry, had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. The long tables had been removed, replaced by a single, imposing chair placed on a raised dais at the far end of the hall. This was the king's seat, his throne of judgment. King Alaric sat upon the throne, his face grim, his eyes cold. He was dressed in his full regalia, his crown gleaming in the light of the torches that lined the walls. He looked every inch the king, a figure of authority and power. The Queen and Lord Ashford stood before the throne, flanked by their own guards. The Queen was dressed in a gown of deep purple, her face pale but composed, her expression defiant. Ashford stood beside her, his face a mask of stoic calm, his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. The hall was filled with courtiers, nobles, and guards, all standing in silent anticipation. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence. It was a scene of high drama, a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. Emmeline took her place near the king, Sir Roderick standing beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He was her protector, her shield, her only ally in this dangerous game. The king began the proceedings, his voice booming through the hall, echoing off the stone walls. "You stand accused," he said, his gaze fixed on the Queen and Lord Ashford, "of treason, of plotting against the crown, of conspiring to overthrow the rightful king." The Queen stepped forward, her head held high, her voice clear and strong. "I deny these accusations, Your Majesty," she said. "They are false, malicious lies, spread by those who seek to undermine my position, to sow discord within the realm." She looked at Emmeline, her eyes filled with hatred, with venom. "This woman," she said, pointing a finger at Emmeline, "is a traitor, a spy. She has fabricated these accusations to save her own skin, to curry favor with the king." Emmeline felt a shiver of fear run down her spine, but she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. She had anticipated this, had prepared herself for the Queen's denials, her counter-accusations. Lord Ashford stepped forward, his voice smooth and persuasive. "I, too, deny these accusations, Your Majesty," he said. "I am a loyal servant of the crown. I have always served you faithfully, with honor and integrity. I know nothing of these alleged plots, these supposed conspiracies." He looked at the king, his expression earnest, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I am a victim of circumstance, Your Majesty," he said. "A pawn in a game I do not understand." It was a masterful performance, a carefully crafted display of innocence and sincerity. Ashford was a skilled manipulator, a master of deception. The king listened to their denials, his expression unchanged, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He then turned to Emmeline. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice sharp and demanding, "you have made these accusations. You have presented your evidence. Do you stand by your testimony?" Emmeline took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Sir Roderick, seeking his reassurance. He nodded, his expression encouraging. "I do, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I stand by my testimony. I swear on my life, and on the life of my son, that everything I have said is true." She then recounted her story, speaking clearly and concisely, presenting the evidence she had gathered, the details she had learned. She spoke of the Queen's secret meetings, her coded messages, her alliances with the Southern lords. She spoke of Ashford's ambition, his ruthlessness, his involvement in the Northern Rebellion. As she spoke, the Queen and Lord Ashford interrupted frequently, objecting to her testimony, accusing her of lying, of fabricating evidence. But Emmeline persevered, her voice unwavering, her determination unshaken. Sir Roderick stepped forward, supporting Emmeline's testimony, presenting his own evidence, the observations he had made, the whispers he had heard. He spoke of the queen's growing power, her influence over the king, her manipulation of the court. He spoke of Ashford's dangerous ambition, his history of violence, his threat to the stability of the realm. The confrontation lasted for hours, a grueling battle of words and wills. The tension in the hall was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on everyone present. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the king raised his hand, silencing the arguments, the accusations, the denials. "Enough," he said, his voice weary and strained. "I have heard enough." He looked at the queen, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Isolde," he said, his voice barely a whisper, I do not know what to believe. I do not know who to trust." The queen met his gaze, her expression defiant, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "Believe me, your majesty," she pleaded. "I am your wife, your queen. I would never betray you." The king then turned to Lord Ashford, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "Ashford," he said, his voice harsh and demanding, "you have sworn your loyalty to me. You have served me faithfully for many years. Can you look me in the eye and deny these accusations?" Ashford met his gaze, his expression unwavering, his voice firm and resolute. "I can, your majesty," he said. "I swear on my honor, on my life, that I am innocent." The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Ashford's face. He seemed to be searching for something, some sign of truth, some hint of deception. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with decision. "There is only one way to settle this," he said. "A trial by combat." A gasp went through the hall. A trial by combat. It was an ancient tradition, a barbaric custom, rarely used in these times. It was a test of strength, of skill, of divine judgment. "Lord Ashford," the king said, "you will choose a champion to fight for you. The queen, she will have Sir Roderick." Emmeline's heart leaped into her throat. Sir Roderick? He was to fight for the queen? Against Ashford's champion? Roderick's face showed no emotion. He merely bowed. "As your majesty commands." Ashford paled. "But my king." Silence. Alaric roared. "The gods will decide the truth. Tomorrow, at dawn." A cruel twist. A tournament built on treachery. And Sir Roderick, caught in the middle. Emmeline felt a chill. She looked toward him, a question, a plea in her eyes. Chapter 10. A glimmer of trust. The pronouncement of a trial by combat sent a ripple of shock and anticipation through the assembled court. Emmeline's mind reeled. Sir Roderick, her protector, the man she had come to trust, was now bound to fight for the queen, the very woman he believed was guilty of treason. It was a cruel irony, a twisted turn of fate that seemed designed to test the limits of loyalty and betrayal. She sought his gaze across the crowded hall, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He met her eyes, his expression unreadable, his usual stoicism masking any hint of his inner turmoil. There was a subtle nod, a barely perceptible reassurance, but it did little to quell the rising tide of fear within her. The king dismissed the court, and the hall emptied quickly, the nobles and courtiers dispersing into the corridors, their whispers and speculations filling the air. Emmeline remained standing, rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of the king's decree. Sir Roderick approached her, his presence a calming force in the midst of the chaos. "Walk with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. He led her away from the hall, through a maze of corridors and stairways, to a small, secluded garden tucked away behind the castle walls. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of late-blooming roses and damp earth a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the great hall. "He suspects her," Roderick said, breaking the silence, his voice a low murmur. "The king suspects the queen, but he cannot openly accuse her without proof. The trial by combat, it is a way to force the truth to the surface." Emmeline nodded, understanding. The king was walking a tightrope, balancing his suspicions against the need to maintain order and avoid a civil war. The trial by combat was a gamble, a desperate attempt to resolve the conflict without resorting to outright accusations and open warfare. But you, she said, her voice trembling slightly, you are to fight for her. Against whom? Roderick's expression hardened. Ashford will choose his best warrior, he said. Someone skilled, someone ruthless, someone who will not hesitate to kill. The thought sent a shiver of fear down Emmeline's spine. Sir Roderick was a formidable warrior, she knew, but he was also human. He could be injured, he could be killed. You could refuse, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You could defy the king's order. He shook his head.
I cannot, he said.
I am sworn to serve the king. To disobey his command would be treason. His loyalty was unwavering, his sense of duty absolute. It was one of the things she admired about him, yet it was also the very thing that placed him in mortal danger. But it is a trap, she said, her voice rising in desperation. The queen, she will use this to her advantage. She will find a way to ensure your defeat. Roderick smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that did little to soften the harsh lines of his face.
Perhaps, he said.
But I am not without resources of my own. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He simply offered a cryptic assurance, a hint of a plan hidden beneath the surface. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, the only sound breaking the stillness of the garden. Emmeline's mind raced, trying to anticipate the queen's next move, trying to find a way to help Roderick, to protect him. There must be something I can do, she said, finally, her voice filled with frustration. I cannot simply stand by and watch you risk your life for a woman who despises you. Roderick stopped, turning to face her. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. The familiar gesture, the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers, it brought a flicker of comfort, a moment of respite from the fear that consumed her. You have already done much, Emmeline, he said, his voice low and gentle. You have risked your life, your son's life, to expose the truth. That is more than enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for her. She had come to care for this man, this silent, stoic warrior, this protector. She could not stand idly by while he faced danger, while he fought for a cause he did not believe in. Tell me, she said, her voice pleading, tell me what I can do. How can I help you? He hesitated, then nodded, slowly. There is one thing, he said. But it is dangerous. It could expose you to even greater risk. She met his gaze, her chin held high, her eyes filled with determination. I am not afraid, she said. Tell me. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper against her ear. The queen, she has a weakness, he said. A secret. Something she desperately wants to keep hidden. Emmeline's heart skipped a beat. A secret. A weakness. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn the tables on the queen. What is it? She asked, her voice barely audible. Roderick hesitated again, his eyes searching hers, assessing her trustworthiness, her resolve. There was a lover, he said, finally, his voice low and strained. Years ago, before she married the king. A man of low birth, a commoner. A forbidden love. Emmeline's mind raced. A forbidden love. A secret from the queen's past. It was a dangerous weapon, one that could be used to discredit her, to weaken her position. And this lover? She asked. Where is he now? Roderick shook his head. I do not know, he said. He disappeared. Vanished without a trace. Some say he was killed, others that he fled the kingdom. But there is a memento. A token of their love. Something the queen still keeps hidden. He looked deeply into her eyes. Find it. And the queen's leverage vanishes. It will break her. A glimmer of trust. But it could also shatter everything. She would need to find the item before the queen realized the depth of her betrayal. Chapter 11. The Lion's Den. The queen's chambers were a forbidden realm, a lion's den where Emmeline had once walked as a seemingly trusted member of the Pride, but now entered as a trespasser, a thief in the night. The very air seemed thick with danger, with the unspoken threat of discovery. After leaving the secluded garden, Sir Roderick had provided Emmeline with a small, almost imperceptible window of opportunity. He had arranged for a distraction, a minor fire in the kitchens that would draw away most of the guards, leaving the queen's chambers relatively unguarded. It was a risky gambit, one that could easily backfire, but it was the only chance they had. Emmeline moved silently through the darkened corridors, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She wore a simple, dark gown, designed to blend in with the shadows, her hair hidden beneath a hooded cloak. She carried a small, concealed dagger, a gift from Sir Roderick, a last resort in case of discovery. She reached the queen's chambers, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. It was unlocked, as Roderick had promised. He had used his influence, his knowledge of the castle's secrets, to ensure her access. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the stillness. The chambers were dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering candles and the embers of a dying fire in the hearth. The air was heavy with the scent of the queen's signature perfume, a cloying, overpowering fragrance that made Emmeline's stomach churn. She began her search, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. The chambers were opulent, filled with luxurious furnishings, expensive tapestries, and glittering jewels. It was a display of wealth and power, a testament to the queen's vanity and ambition. Emmeline knew she had limited time. The distraction in the kitchens would not last long. She had to find the memento, the token of the queen's forbidden love, quickly and efficiently. She started with the obvious places: the queen's jewelry box, her dressing table, her writing desk. She searched through drawers and compartments, her fingers carefully sifting through silks and velvets, through letters and documents, through jewels and trinkets. But she found nothing. Nothing that hinted at a secret lover, a forbidden past. She moved on to the less obvious places: the bookshelves, the hidden compartments behind the tapestries, the spaces beneath the furniture. She searched with a growing sense of desperation, her time running out, her fear of discovery increasing with every passing moment. She was about to give up, to admit defeat, when her fingers brushed against something hidden within the lining of a large, ornate chest. It was a small, concealed pocket, barely noticeable, cleverly disguised. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She carefully reached inside the pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was old, the wood worn smooth with age, the carving faded but still visible. She opened the box, her hands trembling. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a locket. It was a simple locket made of silver, shaped like a heart. She opened it, revealing 2 miniature portraits. One was of the queen, younger, her face softer, her eyes filled with a light that was no longer there. The other was of a man Emmeline did not recognize. He was handsome, with dark hair and striking features, but his clothing was simple, his bearing unassuming. He was, as Sir Roderick had said, a commoner. But it was not the portraits that caught Emmeline's attention. It was the inscription on the back of the locket. A single word, a name: Rhys. Rhys. The queen's forbidden lover. The man who had disappeared, vanished without a trace. Emmeline closed the locket, her heart pounding in her chest. She had found it. She had found the queen's weakness, the secret that could destroy her. She carefully placed the wooden box back in its hiding place, smoothing the lining of the chest to conceal any sign of her intrusion. She had to leave, to get out of the queen's chambers before she was discovered. As she turned to go, she heard a sound. A soft footstep, a rustle of fabric, a muffled cough. She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She was not alone. She slowly turned, her hand reaching for the dagger hidden beneath her cloak. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light of the corridor, was the queen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and fury. She had caught Emmeline red-handed in the act of betrayal. "You," the queen whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. "What are you doing here?" Emmeline knew she had only one chance to escape, to survive. She drew the dagger, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the queen. I know your secret, she said, her voice surprisingly calm, betraying none of the fear that churned within. I know about Rhys. The queen's eyes widened, her expression shifting from fury to fear. The name, the single word, had struck its mark. Stay back, Emmeline warned. Her escape was paramount. If she could make it to Roderick. The queen took a step forward, her hand reaching for the belt buckle that would summon the guards. Emmeline had to make a choice. She could not risk a physical fight. I have the locket, Emmeline said, the words a desperate gamble. And I will show it to the king. The queen stopped, her hand freezing inches from the belt pull. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Emmeline seized the opportunity. Get out of my way. The hallway. Roderick. The king. These were her only hopes. Chapter 12. Echoes of Betrayal. The queen hesitated, her eyes darting between Emmeline's face and the dagger she held. The mention of the locket, of Rhys, had clearly shaken her, disrupting her composure, creating a crack in her carefully constructed facade. It was a moment of vulnerability, a fleeting opportunity that Emmeline had to seize. You wouldn't dare, the queen hissed, her voice laced with venom, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Try me, Emmeline replied, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. She held the dagger steady, not in a threatening manner, but as a symbol of her resolve, her willingness to fight for her survival. The standoff lasted for what seemed like an eternity, the silence broken only by the crackling of the embers in the hearth and the ragged breathing of the two women. Emmeline could feel the queen's gaze boring into her, assessing her, probing for any sign of weakness, any hint of bluff. Finally, the queen stepped aside, a flicker of defeat in her eyes. Get out, she said, her voice low and strained. Get out, and never come near me again. Emmeline didn't hesitate. She slipped past the queen, keeping the dagger concealed but ready, her senses on high alert. She moved quickly and silently through the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had escaped the queen's chambers, but she was far from safe. The castle was still a dangerous place, filled with the queen's loyalists, with guards who would not hesitate to arrest her, to kill her, on the queen's orders. She needed to find Sir Roderick. He was her only ally, her only protector. He would know what to do, how to navigate this treacherous situation. She made her way through the darkened corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the shadows, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She encountered a few servants, a couple of guards, but she managed to avoid detection, slipping past them like a ghost, a whisper in the night. She finally reached the small garden where she had met Sir Roderick earlier. She found him there, waiting for her, his face etched with worry, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. You are safe, he said, his voice a mixture of relief and concern, as she approached. She nodded, breathless. I have it, she said, holding up the locket. I found it. He took the locket from her, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver of warmth through her. He examined it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the portraits, the inscription. Rhys, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. So it is true. He looked up at her, his expression filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. You did well, Emmeline, he said, his voice low and gentle. You were brave.
Brave.
It was a word she had rarely associated with herself. She had always considered herself to be cautious, pragmatic, a survivor. But tonight, she had been brave. She had faced her fear, had confronted the queen, had risked everything to uncover the truth. But it is not over yet, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The queen she knows. She will not let this go unpunished. Roderick nodded.
I know, he said.
We must act quickly. We must present this to the king before she can retaliate. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Come, he said. We have no time to lose. They made their way to the king's chambers, their footsteps echoing through the silent corridors. The castle seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act of this drama to unfold. They reached the king's chambers, finding the guards still at their posts. Roderick spoke to them, his voice low and urgent, and they stepped aside, allowing them entry. The king was awake, sitting by the fireplace, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening in surprise. "Roderick?" he said. "Lady Emmeline? What is the meaning of this? It is the middle of the night." Roderick stepped forward, bowing low. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have urgent news. News that cannot wait." He held up the locket.
"We have proof," he said.
Proof of the Queen's treachery. The king's eyes fixed on the locket, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief. He reached out, his hand trembling, and took the locket from Roderick. He examined it carefully, his eyes widening as he recognized the portraits, the inscription. "Reese," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Who is this?" Emmeline stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "He was the Queen's lover, Your Majesty," she said.
"Before she married you."
"A forbidden love, a secret she has kept hidden for years." She recounted the story, the details Sir Roderick had shared with her, the Queen's desperate attempts to conceal the truth. The king listened in silence, his face growing increasingly pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. He looked at the locket again. He opened it, touched the image of the Queen's younger face. She loved him? It was barely a question. Roderick stepped forward. "Majesty, the Queen has used this information to maintain her power, and she has acted in concert with Ashford." The king looked up, meeting their gaze. His sorrow was turning to steel. "Bring her to me."
Now.
It wasn't a trial they were going to. It was an execution. Chapter 13. The Unspoken Vow. The air in the king's chambers crackled with a tension so thick it felt almost palpable. The summons had been delivered, swift and silent, and now they waited. Emmeline stood beside Sir Roderick, her hand unconsciously seeking his, finding solace in the warmth and strength of his grip. His presence was a grounding force, a beacon of calm in the swirling storm of emotions that threatened to consume her. The king remained seated by the fireplace, the locket clutched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the flames, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had aged years in the past few hours, the weight of betrayal etched deep into the lines of his face. Finally, the doors to the chambers opened, and the Queen was ushered in, flanked by 2 guards. She stood tall, her head held high, her expression defiant, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, a hint of uncertainty. She was dressed in a simple nightgown, her hair loose and unkempt, a stark contrast to the regal image she usually presented. The king looked up, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "Isolde," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You stand accused of treason, of deceiving me, your king, your husband." The Queen met his gaze, her chin held high. "I deny these accusations, Your Majesty," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the fear that must have been churning within. "They are lies, fabrications, spread by a jealous woman and a power-hungry knight." She looked at Emmeline, her eyes filled with hatred, with venom. "This woman," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "is a traitor, a liar. She has betrayed my trust, has sought to undermine my position, to destroy me." Emmeline felt a shiver of fear run down her spine, but she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. She had come too far, had risked too much, to back down now. The king held up the locket, his hand trembling slightly. "What is this, then?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper.
"A fabrication?"
"A lie?" The Queen's eyes widened, her expression shifting from defiance to panic. She recognized the locket, the token of her forbidden love, the secret she had guarded so carefully for so many years. It is nothing," she stammered, her voice losing its strength, its conviction. "A trinket, a memento from my youth." The king rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the Queen. He approached her, his presence looming over her, his anger a palpable force. "Nothing?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You call this nothing? This is proof of your betrayal, Isolde. Proof of your lies." He opened the locket, revealing the portraits, the inscription. Reese, he said, the name a bitter curse on his lips. Who is he, Isolde? Tell me the truth. The queen's facade finally crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, streaming down her pale cheeks. She sank to her knees, her body shaking with sobs. He was my lover, she confessed, her voice a broken whisper. Before I met you, before I became queen. She recounted the story, the details of her forbidden love, her desperate attempts to keep it hidden, her fear of exposure. It was a story of passion and regret, of love and loss, of a secret that had haunted her for years. As she spoke, the king listened in silence, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. He had loved her, had trusted her, had given her everything. And she had deceived him, had betrayed him, had used him. Finally, she fell silent, her body racked with sobs, her spirit broken. She looked up at the king, her eyes pleading for mercy, for forgiveness. But there was no mercy in the king's eyes, no forgiveness in his heart. He had been wounded too deeply, betrayed too profoundly. Guards, he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Take her away. The guards stepped forward, seizing the queen, dragging her from the chambers. Her screams echoed through the corridors, a chilling testament to her fall from grace, her descent into despair. The king remained standing, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. He then, very slowly, looked at Ashford, who had remained silent. And you, Alaric stated, his tone now icy. Your champion awaits. Roderick bowed. I will prepare, Majesty. He turned to leave. But then, he looked at Emmeline. The unspoken vow hung between them, a shared understanding. He nodded just once. He did not need to say words. He would fight. For the kingdom. For her. Chapter 14. Beyond the castle walls. The dawn of the trial by combat broke gray and ominous, the sky a canvas of swirling clouds that mirrored the turmoil within Emmeline's heart. She had barely slept, her mind tormented by visions of Sir Roderick facing Ashford's champion, of steel meeting steel, of life and death hanging in the balance. She had been forbidden from attending the trial, confined to her chambers under the watchful eyes of the king's guards. It was for her own protection, they said, but it felt more like a prison, a gilded cage that separated her from the man she had come to care for. She paced restlessly, her footsteps echoing through the silent chamber, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. She tried to pray, to find solace in faith, but the words felt hollow, empty, offering no comfort, no reassurance. She went to the window, staring out at the courtyard below, where the trial was to take place. She could see the crowds gathering, the nobles and courtiers, the soldiers and servants, all eager to witness the spectacle, the brutal clash of arms that would determine the fate of the Queen and Lord Ashford. But she could not see Sir Roderick. He was hidden from view, preparing for the battle, steeling himself for the ordeal ahead. She closed her eyes, picturing him in her mind. His strong, stoic face, his dark, enigmatic eyes, his unwavering loyalty, his quiet strength. He was a warrior, a protector, a man of honor. And he was fighting for her, for the truth, for the kingdom. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Enter, she said, her voice a little shaky. It was one of the king's guards, a young man with a kind face and sympathetic eyes. My lady, he said, bowing respectfully, Sir Roderick has requested your presence. Emmeline's heart skipped a beat. He had requested her presence? But she had been forbidden the king. He has granted permission. The guard continued, anticipating her question.
He believes it is your right.
You're right. It was an unexpected gesture, a sign of the king's respect, trust, perhaps even gratitude. Emmeline didn't hesitate. She followed the guard, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to see him, to speak to him, before the trial began. They made their way through the castle, the corridors echoing with the sounds of the gathering crowd, the air thick with anticipation. They reached a small antechamber near the courtyard, where Sir Roderick was waiting. He was dressed in full armor, his helmet tucked under his arm, his sword strapped to his side. He looked every inch the warrior, a figure of strength and power. But his eyes, when he saw her, softened, betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of something else. "Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze fixed on her face. She rushed to him, her hands reaching out to touch him, to reassure herself that he was real, that he was there. "You are ready?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded. "I am," he said. "As I will ever be." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read his thoughts, his emotions. I am afraid," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of protection. "Do not be," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I will not fail." It was a vow, a solemn pledge, spoken with a conviction that sent a shiver of warmth through her. She believed him. She trusted him. But if she began, her voice catching in her throat, unable to voice the unspoken fear, the possibility of his defeat, his death. He silenced her with a finger to her lips.
"No," he said.
"There is no if. I will return to you." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead, a fleeting, tender kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a gesture of affection, of love. It was a promise, a hope, a silent vow. "Wait for me," he said, his voice a soft murmur against her ear. Then, he donned his helmet, obscuring his face, transforming him into a figure of war, a symbol of strength and defiance. He turned and walked towards the courtyard, his footsteps echoing through the antechamber, his silhouette disappearing into the bright sunlight. Emmeline remained standing, rooted to the spot, her heart aching, her mind filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She would wait for him. She would wait for him, beyond the castle walls, beyond the trial, beyond the darkness. She would wait for him, with a prayer on her lips and love in her heart. Because now, the future lay beyond the battle. The future of the kingdom rested on him. Chapter 15. A tapestry of lies. The roar of the crowd was a distant, muffled sound, filtering through the thick stone walls of the antechamber, a constant reminder of the brutal spectacle unfolding in the courtyard below. Emmeline stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the scene, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could see the two figures in the center of the courtyard, locked in mortal combat. Sir Roderick, her protector, her love, facing Ashford's champion, a hulking brute of a man, his face hidden behind a visored helmet, his movements swift and brutal. The clash of steel on steel echoed through the air, a sharp, metallic sound that made Emmeline's skin crawl. She watched, her breath held captive in her chest, as they fought, their bodies a blur of motion, their swords flashing in the sunlight. It was a brutal, barbaric dance, a test of strength and skill, of courage and endurance.
But it was also more than that.
It was a battle between good and evil, between truth and lies, between hope and despair. Emmeline could not tear her gaze away, her eyes fixed on Sir Roderick, willing him to victory, praying for his survival. She saw him stumble, saw him fall, saw him rise again, his armor dented and stained, his movements slower, but his determination unwavering. The crowd roared, their cheers and jeers a cacophony of sound, their emotions a volatile mixture of excitement and bloodlust. Emmeline ignored them, her focus solely on Sir Roderick, her heart aching with every blow he received, every near miss, every moment of peril. She saw Ashford standing at the edge of the courtyard, his face a mask of cold calculation, his eyes fixed on the battle, his hopes pinned on his champion's victory. She saw the king, sitting on his makeshift throne, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. And then she saw her, the queen. She was standing near the king, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear? No, not fear. Something else. Something cunning. Emmeline's instincts screamed at her. Something was wrong. Something was not right. The queen was not watching the battle. She was watching the king. And she was smiling. A cold dread washed over Emmeline, a chilling premonition of disaster. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that the trial by combat was a sham, a carefully orchestrated plot, a tapestry of lies woven by the Queen and Lord Ashford. But what was their plan? What were they trying to achieve? Emmeline's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information, the subtle clues, the unspoken hints. The Queen's secret lover, the locket, Ashford's ambition, the King's vulnerability, and then it hit her. The King. They were going to kill the King. The trial by combat was a distraction, a diversion, designed to draw attention away from the real target. While everyone was focused on the battle in the courtyard, the Queen and Ashford would make their move, seizing the opportunity to eliminate the King and claim the throne. Emmeline had to act, had to warn them, had to stop them. But how? She was confined to the antechamber, guarded by the King's own men. She looked around, her eyes searching for a way out, a means of escape. There was a small door, hidden behind a tapestry, that led to a narrow passage, a secret way to the King's chambers. She had discovered it years ago, during her explorations of the castle, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. It was her only chance. She slipped behind the tapestry, her heart pounding in her chest, her movements swift and silent. She found the door, unlocked and unguarded, and slipped through, closing it silently behind her. She found herself in a narrow, dusty passage, dimly lit by a few flickering torches. She followed the passage, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor, her senses on high alert. She reached the end of the passage, finding another door, this one leading to the King's private chambers. She could hear voices on the other side, muffled and indistinct, but she recognized the King's voice and the Queen's. She hesitated, her hand on the door handle, her mind racing. She had to be careful, had to be strategic. She could not simply burst in, shouting accusations. She needed proof, evidence, something to convince the King of the Queen's treachery. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, her resolve. She would confront them, expose their plot, save the King. She pushed the door open, stepping into the King's chambers, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. The King was sitting in his chair, his back to her, his head bowed. The Queen was standing before him, her hand outstretched, holding a small, ornate dagger. It was the same kind of poison she had used in Ashford's wine. The tapestry of lies was about to be stained with blood. Emmeline screamed.
No.
Chapter 16. The Heart's Reckoning. The King and Queen both startled, whirling around to face Emmeline, their expressions a mixture of shock and guilt. The Queen's hand, still holding the ornate dagger, trembled slightly, betraying her murderous intent. The King's eyes widened, his face paling as he realized the danger he was in. "Emmeline?" he said, his voice a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What is the meaning of this?" Emmeline stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the Queen, her voice firm and unwavering. "She was going to kill you, Your Majesty," she said, her words ringing through the silent chamber. "She was going to poison you, just like she poisoned others." The Queen's face contorted in fury, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You lie," she screamed. "You are a traitor, a spy. You have fabricated this charade to save your own skin." But the King's gaze was not on the Queen. It was on the dagger, still clutched in her hand, its ornate carvings glinting in the light of the fireplace. He saw the truth in Emmeline's eyes, the conviction in her voice, the desperation in her plea. "Isolde?" he said, his voice a low, trembling whisper. "Is this true?" The Queen hesitated, her eyes darting between the King and Emmeline, her mind racing, searching for a way out, a way to salvage her plan. But it was too late. The truth had been revealed. The tapestry of lies had been torn apart. It was Ashford, she stammered, her voice losing its strength, its conviction.
He forced me.
He threatened to harm our son. It was a lie, a desperate attempt to shift the blame, to save herself. But the King did not believe her. He had seen the truth in Emmeline's eyes, had heard it in her voice. He had seen the proof in the queen's hand, the dagger poised to strike.
Guards.
He roared, his voice filled with a fury that shook the very foundations of the chamber. Seize her. The doors to the chamber burst open, and the king's guards rushed in, their swords drawn, their faces grim. They seized the queen, her struggles futile against their strength, her screams echoing through the room. The king rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Emmeline. He approached her, his presence towering over her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You saved my life, Emmeline," he said, his voice low and strained. "You risked everything to protect me." Emmeline met his gaze, her chin held high, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I did what I had to do, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm. "I could not stand by and watch you be murdered." The king nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. He had been betrayed by his wife, by the woman he had loved, by the woman he had trusted. The pain of that betrayal was etched deep into the lines of his face. "What of the trial?" Emmeline asked, her voice a whisper, her thoughts turning to Sir Roderick, still battling for his life in the courtyard below. The king's expression hardened.
"It is over," he said.
"Ashford's treachery is clear. His champion will be dealt with."
He turned to the guards.
"Send word to the courtyard," he ordered. "The trial is ended. Sir Roderick is victorious. And arrest Lord Ashford. He will answer for his crimes." The guards bowed and departed, their footsteps echoing through the chamber, leaving Emmeline and the king alone. The king looked at Emmeline, his eyes filled with a new respect, a new understanding. "You are a brave woman, Emmeline," he said, "and a loyal one. You have served me well." Emmeline bowed her head, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and hope. She had survived. She had saved the king. She had exposed the queen's treachery. But her thoughts were not on her own survival, her own victory. They were on Sir Roderick, on the man who had fought for her, for the truth, for the kingdom. She had to see him.
She had to know that he was safe.
"Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly, may I go to him? To Sir Roderick?" The king nodded, his expression softening.
"You may," he said.
"You have earned that right." Emmeline curtsied deeply, then turned and fled the chamber, her heart pounding in her chest, her footsteps echoing through the corridors. She raced towards the courtyard, her mind filled with a single, desperate hope, to see him, to hold him, to know that he was alive. It was a heart's reckoning, a moment of truth. Chapter 17. Flames of Defiance. The courtyard was a scene of chaos and confusion. The news of the king's decree, of the queen's arrest and Ashford's treachery, had spread like wildfire, throwing the assembled crowd into a frenzy. Guards were scrambling to restore order, their shouts and commands barely audible above the roar of the crowd. Emmeline pushed her way through the throng, her eyes searching for Sir Roderick, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She saw him, finally, standing near the center of the courtyard, his armor battered and stained, his sword still in his hand, but his face was triumphant. He had won. He had survived. She ran towards him, her arms outstretched, her voice calling his name. "Roderick." He turned, his eyes widening as he saw her, his expression shifting from grim determination to relief. He dropped his sword, the clang echoing through the courtyard, and opened his arms to receive her. She collided with him, her body trembling, her tears flowing freely. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and steel and sweat. He was alive. He was safe. He held her close, his arms strong and protective, his body a haven of warmth and security. He stroked her hair, murmuring soothing words, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It is over, Emmeline," he said. "It is over." She nodded, her tears soaking his tunic, her body shaking with relief. She didn't want to let go, didn't want to break the embrace, afraid that if she did, he would disappear, that this moment of reunion would be nothing more than a dream. But she knew she had to. There were things to be done, questions to be answered, a future to be faced. She pulled back, looking up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're not hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He shook his head. "A few bruises, nothing more," he said. Ashford's champion, he was strong, but he was no match for the truth. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face, transforming him from a grim warrior into a man of warmth and tenderness. It was a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of victory, of relief, of love. "And Ashford?" she asked, her voice still a little shaky. Roderick's expression hardened.
"He tried to escape," he said. "But the guards, they captured him.
He will face the king's justice." Justice. It was a word that echoed through the courtyard, a word that spoke of retribution, of punishment, of closure. But for Emmeline, justice was not enough. She wanted more. She wanted peace, she wanted safety, she wanted a future. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "Now," he said, his voice low and husky, "we rebuild. We heal. We begin again." His words were a promise, a hope, a vow. They spoke of a future free from fear, free from betrayal, free from the shadows of the past. They spoke of a future together. But before they could embrace that future, there was one last flame to extinguish, one last act of defiance to confront. As they stood there, surrounded by the chaos of the courtyard, a figure emerged from the crowd, a figure shrouded in darkness, a figure filled with rage and desperation. It was the Queen. She had somehow escaped her guards, her face contorted in fury, her eyes blazing with madness. She held a torch in her hand, its flames flickering wildly, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding walls.
"You will not win,"
she screamed, her voice a shrill, piercing cry that cut through the noise of the crowd. "You will not defeat me. I will burn it all down. I will destroy everything." She lunged towards the nearby stables, her intention clear, to set them ablaze, to create a conflagration that would engulf the castle, that would destroy everything and everyone in its path. It was an act of desperation, of madness, of a woman consumed by hatred and driven by a thirst for revenge. Roderick reacted instantly, his warrior instincts taking over. He pushed Emmeline behind him, shielding her with his body, and drew his sword, ready to defend her, to defend the castle, to defend the future. "Isolde, stop," he commanded. But the Queen was beyond reason, beyond control. She was a force of destruction, a flame of defiance that threatened to consume them all. The straw, the wood, it would all go up in a second. Emmeline knew that Roderick could not, would not, hurt a woman, even this one.
"No,"
Emmeline shouted. She had to try and stop her. Chapter 18. The Weight of the Crown. The Queen ignored Roderick's command, her eyes fixed on the stables, her torch held high, her intention clear and terrifying. She was a whirlwind of madness and rage, a destructive force unleashed. Emmeline knew that Roderick would hesitate to strike down a woman, even one as dangerous as Isolde. His code of honor, his inherent chivalry, would prevent him from taking the necessary action. And in that hesitation, the castle, and everyone within it, could be engulfed in flames.
"No,"
Emmeline shouted again, pushing past Roderick, stepping between him and the Queen. She had to stop her, had to find a way to reason with her, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity remained within her. "Isolde, stop," she pleaded, her voice firm but compassionate.
"This is not the way.
This will not solve anything. It will only bring more pain, more destruction." The Queen turned, her eyes blazing with fury, her face contorted in a mask of hatred.
"You,"
she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You did this. You ruined everything. You will pay for this." She lunged towards Emmeline, the torch held like a weapon, the flames licking at the air, threatening to ignite her gown, her hair. Emmeline stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze unwavering. She would not cower, would not run, would not allow the queen to destroy everything she had fought for. "It is over, Isolde," she said, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the fear that churned within. "Your reign of terror is ended. Your secrets have been revealed. Your power is gone." The queen hesitated, her eyes flickering, her expression shifting from rage to uncertainty. Emmeline's words, her calm demeanor, seemed to have penetrated the fog of her madness, creating a flicker of doubt, a moment of hesitation. "Rhys," Emmeline continued, her voice soft but firm, "he would not want this. He would not want you to destroy yourself, to destroy others in his name." The name, the single word, struck its mark. The queen's eyes widened, her body trembling, the torch slipping from her grasp, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The flames flickered, then died, leaving only a wisp of smoke and the lingering scent of burning wood. The queen sank to her knees, her body racked with sobs, her spirit broken. The madness had passed, replaced by a crushing wave of grief, of regret, of despair. "Rhys," she whispered, her voice a broken murmur. I loved him." Emmeline knelt beside her, reaching out to touch her, to offer a gesture of comfort, of compassion. But she stopped short, her hand hovering in the air, unsure whether to offer solace or condemnation. The queen looked up, her eyes filled with tears, her face stained with soot and ash. "It was all for nothing," she said, her voice barely audible. "All the lies, all the betrayals, all the pain. It was all for nothing." Emmeline nodded, her heart aching for this woman, this broken queen, this fallen enemy. She understood the pain, the loss, the desperation that had driven her to such extremes. "It is not too late," Emmeline said, her voice soft but firm. "It is not too late to define peace, to find redemption." But the queen shook her head, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding sorrow.
"It is too late," she said.
"I have gone too far. I have done too much. There is no redemption for me." She looked up at the sky, her gaze fixed on the swirling clouds, her face etched with regret. "I deserve whatever punishment the king decrees," she said. "I deserve to die." Emmeline felt a surge of pity, of compassion, for this woman, this broken queen. But she knew that justice had to be served, that the queen had to answer for her crimes. The king's guards arrived, their faces grim, their swords drawn. They approached the queen, their intention clear, to take her into custody, to deliver her to the king's judgment. The queen did not resist. She simply bowed her head, accepting her fate, surrendering to the inevitable. As the guards led her away, her footsteps echoing through the silent courtyard, Emmeline turned to Sir Roderick, her eyes filled with tears. He was standing there, watching her, his expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had witnessed the entire scene, had seen the queen's descent into madness, her final surrender, her acceptance of her fate. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear that had escaped her eye. "It is over," he said, his voice low and gentle. "She is no longer a threat." Emmeline nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and sadness. The queen was gone, her reign of terror ended, but the cost had been high, the scars deep. "What will happen to her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roderick's expression hardened. "That is for the king to decide," he said. "But she will face justice. She will answer for her crimes. The weight of the crown, the burden of power, the responsibility of justice, it was a heavy load to bear. And it was now the king's burden alone. But for them, a glimmer remained. Chapter 19. A Knight's Redemption. The days following the trial by combat and the queen's arrest were a blur of activity and uncertainty. The castle was abuzz with whispers and rumors, with speculation and conjecture, as the news of the dramatic events spread through the kingdom. The king, secluded in his chambers, wrestled with his grief, his anger, and the heavy burden of justice. Emmeline remained at the castle, under the king's protection, but she felt restless, uneasy, her thoughts constantly returning to Sir Roderick. He had been summoned by the king, his fate uncertain, his future hanging in the balance. She had seen him only briefly since the confrontation in the courtyard, a fleeting moment of shared relief and unspoken promises. He had been busy, assisting the king in restoring order, in dealing with the aftermath of the queen's treachery. She paced restlessly in her chambers, her anxieties growing with each passing hour. She feared for him, feared that the king, in his grief and anger, might turn against him, might see him as a reminder of the queen's betrayal. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she received a summons. The king requested her presence in the great hall. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple gown of dark blue wool, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She made her way to the great hall, her footsteps echoing through the silent corridors, her senses on high alert. The great hall was empty, save for the king, who stood near the fireplace, his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the flickering flames. He was dressed in his full regalia, his crown gleaming in the light, but his posture was slumped, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his burdens. "Your Majesty," Emmeline said, curtsying deeply, her voice trembling slightly. The king turned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. He looked older than his years, weary and defeated. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze fixed on her face. "You have served me well. You have proven your loyalty, your courage, your integrity." Emmeline bowed her head, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The king did not blame her, did not see her as an enemy. "I did what I had to do, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm. "I could not stand by and watch you be harmed." The king nodded, his eyes filled with a flicker of appreciation.
"I know," he said.
"And I am grateful." He was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting towards the fireplace, his thoughts lost in the flickering flames. "The Queen," he began, his voice trailing off, unable to complete the sentence. Emmeline understood. The Queen's fate was still undecided, her punishment still to be determined. "She will face justice, Your Majesty," Emmeline said, her voice firm. "She will answer for her crimes." The king nodded, his expression grim. "Justice must be served," he said. "But it is a heavy burden, a difficult choice." He looked at Emmeline, his eyes searching hers, seeking guidance? Understanding? Perhaps even forgiveness. "You have been close to her," he said, his voice hesitant. "You have seen her vulnerability. What do you believe she deserves?" It was an unexpected question, a surprising request. The king was asking her, a woman he had once suspected of treason, to offer her opinion, her judgment on the Queen's fate. Emmeline hesitated, her mind racing. She had seen the Queen's cruelty, her ambition, her treachery. But she had also seen her pain, her regret, her humanity. "She deserves justice, Your Majesty," she said, finally, her voice firm but compassionate. "But she also deserves mercy. She was driven by love, by fear, by desperation. She made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but she is not evil." The king listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He was weighing her words, considering her opinion, struggling with his own conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I will consider your words, Lady Emmeline," he said. "Thank you." He then turned his attention to another matter, a matter that was closer to Emmeline's heart. "Sir Roderick," he said, his voice a little softer, his gaze shifting towards the entrance of the hall. "He has served me faithfully, with honor and courage. He has proven his loyalty, his worth." Emmeline's heart leaped with hope. The king was speaking of Sir Roderick, of his service, of his redemption. As if on cue, the doors to the great hall opened, and Sir Roderick entered, his head held high, his expression unreadable. He was dressed not in armor, but in a simple tunic of dark blue, the color of loyalty, of trust. He approached the king, bowing low. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice respectful but firm. The king looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Sir Roderick," he said, his voice strong and clear.
You have served me well.
You have risked your life, your honor, to protect me, to protect the kingdom. He paused, then continued, his voice filled with emotion. I owe you a debt I can never repay, he said. But I can offer you this. He gestured towards a small table near the fireplace, where a sword lay, its scabbard richly decorated, its hilt gleaming in the light. It was not just any sword. It was the king's own sword, a symbol of power, of authority, of trust. I offer you knighthood, the king said, his voice ringing through the silent hall. I offer you a place at my side, as my advisor, my protector, my friend. It was an extraordinary offer, an unprecedented honor. Sir Roderick, a man of low birth, a man haunted by his past, was being offered a position of power, of influence, of redemption. Sir Roderick's eyes widened, his expression shifting from stoic calm to surprise. He looked at Emmeline, his gaze seeking hers, his eyes filled with a question, a silent plea for guidance? Approval? Emmeline nodded, her heart swelling with pride and love.
He deserved this.
He had earned this. Sir Roderick turned back to the king, his voice firm and unwavering. I accept, your majesty, he said. I will serve you faithfully, with honor and loyalty, until my dying breath. He knelt before the king, bowing his head. The king drew the sword from its scabbard, the blade flashing in the light, and touched it to Sir Roderick's shoulder, first the right, then the left. Rise, Sir Roderick, the king said, his voice filled with emotion. Rise and take your place at my side. Sir Roderick rose, his head held high, his eyes shining with a new light, a light of hope, of purpose, of redemption. He was no longer just a knight, a warrior, a protector. He was something more. He was a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in a kingdom shrouded in darkness. He was her knight, and she his lady. Chapter 20. The Dawn of a New Allegiance. The ceremony was simple, yet profound. With a king's sword resting upon his shoulder, Sir Roderick had been transformed. No longer just a knight, he was now a trusted advisor, a confidant of the king, a man with a voice in the shaping of the kingdom's future. The weight of that responsibility, the honor of that trust, settled upon him, visible in the set of his jaw, the newfound gravity in his eyes. Emmeline watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and a quiet, burgeoning joy. She had witnessed his journey, his struggles, his unwavering loyalty, and now, his redemption. He had earned this, every ounce of recognition, every measure of respect. After the king had bestowed the knighthood, he addressed the hall, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. Let this be a new beginning, he declared. A dawn of a new allegiance, where truth prevails over lies, and loyalty is rewarded above all else. His gaze fell upon Emmeline, and he beckoned her forward. She approached, curtsying deeply, her heart pounding with a nervous anticipation. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore, the king said, his voice strong and clear, you have shown exceptional courage and unwavering loyalty. You have risked your life to protect me, to protect the kingdom. For this, I am eternally grateful. He paused, then continued, his voice softening. I offer you a place at court, not as a spy, not as a pawn, but as an advisor, a counselor, a voice of reason and wisdom. It was an offer she had not expected, an honor she had not sought. But it was an opportunity, a chance to use her skills, her knowledge, her experience, for the good of the kingdom, for the betterment of her people. I accept, your majesty, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. I will serve you faithfully, with honesty and integrity. The king nodded, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. I know you will, he said, and I trust you will keep me grounded. With the formal pronouncements concluded, the king retreated to his private chambers, leaving Emmeline and Sir Roderick alone in the great hall. The silence that descended was not awkward, but charged with unspoken emotions, with the weight of shared experiences, with the promise of a future yet to be explored. Roderick turned to her, his eyes, usually so guarded, now filled with a warmth, a tenderness, that made her breath catch in her throat. "Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze fixed on her face. She reached out, her hand finding his, their fingers interlacing, a connection that felt both familiar and profoundly new. "Roderick," she replied, her voice a soft whisper, her heart overflowing with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and love. He drew her closer, his other hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "You are magnificent," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Brave, resourceful, unwavering." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that reflected the joy and the hope that were blossoming within her. "We did it together," she said. "We faced the darkness, and we prevailed." He nodded, his gaze holding hers, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "We did," he said. And now he didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them, a promise of a future together. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that quickly deepened, becoming a passionate expression of their shared journey, their newfound bond, their undeniable love. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of healing, of a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, the world seemed brighter, the air clearer, the future filled with possibilities.
"What now?"
Emmeline asked, her voice a little breathless, her heart still racing. Roderick smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his face. "Now," he said, "we build a better kingdom. Together." He took her hand, and together, they walked out of the great hall, stepping out of the shadows of the past and into the dawn of a new allegiance, a new beginning, a new love. The castle, once a place of fear and intrigue, now felt like a home, a sanctuary, a place where they could build a future together. The challenges ahead would be significant. The wounds of the past would take time to heal, but they would face them together, with courage, with loyalty, with love. The kingdom was safe, and they were free. Epilogue. 5 years passed. 5 years of peace, of rebuilding, of healing. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome, but they were fading, replaced by the gentle balm of time and the unwavering strength of their shared love. The kingdom flourished under King Alaric's reformed rule. He had learned from his mistakes, had surrounded himself with wise and loyal advisors, and had dedicated himself to the welfare of his people. The queen, stripped of her title and power, was confined to a remote monastery, a place of quiet contemplation and, perhaps, eventual redemption. Lord Ashford had met a swift and just end, his treachery punished, his ambition extinguished. Sir Roderick, now known as Lord Roderick, served as the king's right hand, his trusted advisor, his loyal friend. He had proven himself to be not only a skilled warrior, but a wise and compassionate leader, his counsel valued, his judgment respected. He had earned the trust of the king, the respect of the court, and the love of the people. Emmeline, Lady of Dunmore, and now a respected member of the king's council, had found her purpose, her calling. She used her sharp intellect, her keen observation skills, and her unwavering commitment to justice to advise the king, to advocate for the vulnerable, to build a better, fairer kingdom. Their love, born in the crucible of danger and betrayal, had blossomed and matured, becoming a source of strength, of comfort, of unwavering support. They had married, a quiet ceremony attended by close friends and family, a celebration of their enduring bond, their shared future. Thomas, Emmeline's son, now a young man of 17, had grown into a strong and honorable heir, his future secured, his path guided by the wisdom and love of his mother and his stepfather. He looked up to Roderick, saw him as a role model, a mentor, a father figure. One crisp autumn evening, Emmeline and Roderick stood on the castle walls, overlooking the kingdom they had helped to rebuild. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking panorama of peace and tranquility. Roderick wrapped his arm around Emmeline's waist, drawing her close, his body a source of warmth and comfort against the evening chill. "It is beautiful," Emmeline murmured, her voice filled with contentment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It is, Roderick agreed, his voice a low rumble against her ear. But not as beautiful as you. Emmeline smiled, turning to face him, her eyes shining with love and happiness. She reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek, her thumb tracing the lines of his face, the scars that were a reminder of their shared journey, their hard-won victory. "We did it, Roderick," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We faced the darkness, and we found the light." He nodded, his eyes holding hers, his gaze filled with a depth of love that took her breath away.
"We did," he said.
"And we will continue to do so. Together." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had grown stronger with each passing year, a love that would last a lifetime. As they stood there, embraced against the backdrop of the setting sun, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new obstacles, new threats to face. But they would face them together, with courage, with loyalty, with love. For they had found their new allegiance, not just to the kingdom, but to each other. And that was a bond that could never be broken. Their love was not just their own happiness, but the very heart of a kingdom reborn.